Okay, today we're going to talk about biomes. In particular, we're going to talk about aquatic biomes. But what a biome is a major, a region of a particular type of overall ecosystem that is based on those global climate patterns that we talked about. In other words, terrestrial biomes would be based on the patterns of wet and dry, how hot and cold it was, the amount of rainfall and the temperature are the two big controls. In terms of aquatic biomes, these would be either freshwater, and that would be on land, within the terrestrial ecosystems, and or they're going to be saltwater, which is going to be coastal and part of the ocean. So we're going to talk about those things, and we're kind of grading in terms of the order that we're going in. We're doing the ones that are kind of closest to land, mostly, like starting with freshwater, and then the ones that are further out in the ocean. All right, so let's just start talking about wetlands. There can be freshwater wetlands or saltwater wetlands. Freshwater wetlands would be part of a riverine system. The system has some low-lying areas where there might be some ebb and flow in terms of water. This could also be within, say, for example, in Gainesville, right by Westside Park, there is a wetland. So there's like a low-lying area around that little stream that is coming in, where that area would have water of some percent of the time. So wetlands are divided into two basic types, salt or fresh. And then the salt and fresh are divided into many different types based on what they call hydro period. The hydro period is how long of a wet period they have, sort of on a consistent basis throughout the year. So it can be anywhere from 0 to 2 months, 2 to 4, 4 to 6, etc. And so there's many classifications of wetlands based on that. So if you studied wetland ecology, you would, the different things happen in each one of those. So anyway, that's kind of generally what a wetland is. Wetlands tend to be very productive. That is, they have a lot of plants and a lot of animals that are coming in and using the water and using that sort of protected scenario for laying eggs and that kind of thing. And of course, birds coming in and eating those, snail eggs, for example, or something like that, or fish eggs. So wetlands are considered a very productive and good ecosystem. They're also really good for taking up nutrients, and in particular excess nutrients in an ecosystem. In other words, they will be sequestered in plant growth, and a little bit of influx of nutrients will just be taken up by the plants and keeping the water system relatively clean. So we depend on these wetlands actually for cleaning up water in a lot of cases. Lakes and ponds are the next order. They, of course, are divided because of size. Lakes are bigger, ponds are smaller, and they have 3 zones. They have the littoral zone, the limnetic zone, and the profundal zone. The littoral zone is all around the edge. This is the most productive part of a lake. It has the most plants, and then, of course, kind of like the wetland, it will have the most vegetation, the most organisms coming in and utilizing that vegetation, or fishing in terms of birds or whatever around that vegetation for prey items. The limnetic zone is the open zone. This is like where I call it the fishy zone, because that's where like your bigger fish would be. And it is also the photic zone. It's where you would have phytoplankton floating in the sunlight, and they would be the base of the food web in that part of the system. In fact, the study of lakes is called limnology, based on that limnetic zone. The profundal zone is at the bottom, and the profundal zone is a zone that is usually where the decomposers are. This is where organic matter tends to settle, and that is where decomposers would use the organics. And because of that, and because there's no sunlight down there, it would be fairly low in oxygen and really high in organic matter. This brings to mind a couple of terms that are called eutrophic and oligotrophic. I'm going to just move in so you can see what those are. Eutrophic means high nutrients, and oligotrophic means low nutrient. So comparatively speaking, the limnetic zone would be low nutrient, and the profundal zone would be high nutrient. Now these terms are also used to describe systems in terms of how many nutrients they have, say for example, for a problem situation, that is, you might have excess nutrients from agriculture or something like that, and eutrophic tends to then in that case have sort of a bad connotation. All right, so looking at this top view, this is one of your handouts that you had in your packet. This is what they're talking about right here. They're talking about a eutrophic lake versus oligotrophic. Now, lakes tend to, when they first form, be oligotrophic. That is, they don't have a lot of organic matter or a lot of organisms that are in the littoral zone. The profundal zone isn't very well developed, and the limnetic zone is fairly open, all right? So in the oligotrophic lake, you might have a low diversity of organisms, but maybe a high number of those organisms that like that situation. In the case of eutrophic, though, and this will happen naturally over time, whereas you get more and more organisms coming in, you'll have more and more things accumulating in the profundal zone. You'll have more decomposers, you'll have higher nutrients, you'll have a little less limnetic zone, but regardless of that, you will have a much higher diversity and, generally speaking, a dense fish population. So this is like denser fish, higher diversity. This is, less dense fish, lower diversity, and maybe a lot of a certain kind of fish in that particular case. Now this is the one on the bottom here is like with industrialization, what would happen is that naturally what would happen is you go from oligotrophic through time to eutrophic, and this is, maybe would take, I don't know, 100 years or maybe more or something like that. But within industry or agriculture or something like that, you can make this happen very, very quickly. And in that case, the organisms don't get a chance to sort of succeed and naturally evolve or naturally change over to that kind of system. And you get kind of an upset in what's going on in the ecosystem. All right, so there's that. Another thing to talk about in terms of lakes is you can talk about, and especially in these are in some really big lakes, you might have, areas of different temperature. And especially these are lakes like in northern climates. So this is showing you, how you might have warmer, a little colder, and really cold. And then, of course, the different seasons may cause turnover. That is, so this is winter, and they're talking about how cold it is. And then there's going to be, as the spring comes around, it's going to have a turnover, because remember that as what's happening here is you're thawing out the ice and so forth, and it's cold on the top, and it's going to sink down and push up that kind of slightly warmer water, and it's going to cycle it, and the same kind of thing happens in the autumn as well. But in the summer, of course, it's warmer on the top and colder on the bottom. So yeah, it kind of switches over depending on what season you are in. All right, so I'm not sure I explained that very well, but anyway. All right, so rivers and streams, those are, again, divided based on size. Rivers are big, streams are small. Sometimes we have what we call an ephemeral stream, which means that it's only there some of the time, like when it rains a lot, or we have a hurricane or something like that, or a big storm. And the thing in rivers and streams is the organisms have to either be attached to the side, and usually firmly attached to either the side or the bottom. Like if you have ever been on the Itchituckney, there's grasses and plants that are attached to the bottom as the water flows past. And then there's also free-floating organisms, a lot of plants that might float, or things that have to swim against the current, and like turtles and some of the fish like mullet, for example. Those like to swim against the current, and they will move about and reproduce and so forth within that river system, but they move around, all right? Generally speaking, in the rivers and streams, the source of the river is going to be somewhat oligotrophic, that is less nutrients, and as it moves downriver, it's going to be picking up nutrients. This is because water that enters the river is usually coming from runoff from the land, and as it moves over the land, it's going to be picking up organics and other kinds of nutrients by filtering through the soils, and it will end up in the river system. So as you get down near the end of the river, say for example like the Mississippi Delta, that's very eutrophic ecosystem, lots of nutrients there, and because of that, it might create a wetland, right? A wetland that is got a lot of plants and so forth, and that a lot of organisms can use. All right. Now, estuarine systems are near the edge of the coast. So in Florida, estuaries are formed like this. Okay, so let's say in the Gulf of Mexico, remember the currents in North America are going in a clockwise direction. So here's the Gulf Stream, it's going to go like this. The Caribbean Sea is going to go like this. The Gulf of Mexico is going to go like this. So what is happening here, though, is that when the river, let's say Apalachicola, enters into the Gulf of Mexico, and because of the turn of the earth, the Coriolis effect is going to pull it right, or that is, pull it towards the west. And the Gulf of the currents in the Gulf of Mexico are going to be going the other direction. So what's going to happen is it's going to pull that water back towards the east, and it makes a little circle, and this is called a gyre. And gyres are super important because they keep the nutrients, that is the eutrophic water, circulating, and this makes a really good place for the fisheries, that is the laying of fish eggs and that kind of thing. And it's a very unique ecosystem because you have fresh water, you have salty salt water, and then normal salt water, and then you have fairly salty but nutrient-rich water here. So there's a lot of differences in terms of that one area. There's like a whole lot of different kinds of situations for different kinds of organisms. So you get a mix of different kinds of organisms, and only a few organisms can actually handle all of it. In other words, they can handle the salt and the really high salt, high nutrient, and then the fresh water all at once. So that's kind of an unusual organism. But in terms of the estuary itself, the whole thing together is a very diverse ecosystem, very productive, very diverse. And they're very important, and they occur a lot in the Gulf of Mexico. There's also other estuarian systems like Savannah River, for example, or the St. John's, any place where a freshwater system enters the ocean. It may not have a gyre, but it's going to have that same situation where salt and fresh meet, and there's a mix of high nutrient water with the salt water, and it makes for a good reproduction for fish. All right, so estuaries are important. Now another thing is, so the next thing on the list is coral reefs. So coral reefs are generally found near the coast. If you look at this map here, this is showing you the distribution of coastal ecosystems, or major aquatic ecosystems. And coral reefs are generally in shallower water near the coastline. They have to have a part of shallow water that will enable them to have, water that is somewhere between 10 to 30 feet, so that there's lots of sunlight, because corals, remember, have a symbiotic relationship with algae, and they have to have sunlight. So corals are kind of sensitive. They are also sensitive to pH. So excess carbon dioxide will make it more acidic, and corals don't form well there because they're made of calcium carbonate. So anyway, they're kind of a unique system, and coral reefs end up being kind of an important system in terms of productivity in the ocean, because you have a side that is kind of shallower, and you have certain kinds of kind of like the estuary, where it was fresh and salt. In this case, it's shallow. And then you have the coral reef, which has a lot of little inundations and a lot of places to hide. And so there's a lot of different small kinds of organisms that really use the coral. And then there is the deep side, and that's going to have, you know, the more pelagic kinds of things. That means free swimming. And those kinds of organisms are like sharks and barracuda and dolphins and etc., that kind of thing. So the coral reef is a very productive ecosystem. Another one is the continental shelf. In Florida, the continental shelf extends off of the coast of Florida quite a ways. This is where it's 200 meters or less, and the continental shelf usually supports things like a lot of echinoderms, actually, starfish and sand dollars and rays, a lot of sharks, a lot of stingrays, skates, those kinds of things, and those kinds of organisms. Also, there's like relic reefs there and everything. This is where a lot of our big fish are, like tuna, redfish, those kinds of things. And also in the continental shelf, in the estuarine system and the continental shelf, kind of like the mix there, you might see some of the bottom feeder types of things like shrimp and crab and that kind of stuff, lobster. You know, of course, they're all kind of mixing in and around these various ecosystems that we just talked about. The last one is open ocean. Open ocean, of course, is every place that's blue on this map. Ocean really has what they call the photic zone. The photic zone is where all the sunlight is, and of course that's where all the spell it like that. That is where all the plants or phytoplankton are. So that's like the base of the food web. And then you have the pelagic zone. The pelagic means free swimming, so that's you know, fish that are swimming all around, things like, you know, dolphins, whales, etc., those kinds of things. And then the benthic zone. The benthic zone is the deep ocean where it's really, really dark, and it's also, you know, where a lot of decomposers are. But the benthic organisms are things like the lanternfish and stuff like that. That is that you might have seen Nature Show on. That has, you know, the weird organisms that are living in the dark, because it's really high pressure under all that ocean, and it's also very dark. All right, so they're relying on organisms, they're predators mostly. Around here, these are like all the abysmal zones, you know, into the abyss, abyssal zones, and these are like the very deep areas of the ocean. And those would be, you know, really unique organisms down there because super, super high pressure. You might remember a few years ago there was like some squid, like giant squid, that got washed up. I think it was in China or something, but it was after a typhoon, and it had been washed from deep. And because it came up so fast, it basically exploded. So it was pretty weird looking, but it was giant, and that's because it has to be large to withstand all that pressure. Remember, less surface area per volume if you are large. All right.